On the morning of December 1st, 1948, a well-dressed man was found dead on Somerton Park Beach, Adelaide, Australia, leaning against a seawall as if he had simply fallen asleep. No wallet, no identification. Every single label had been carefully cut from his clothing. 75 years later, despite DNA testing, international appeals, and a small army of obsessive investigators, the world still does not know, with total certainty, who he was. This is the story of the Somerton Man, a case so strange that Australian police, journalists, and codebreakers have spent 3/4 of a century chasing a ghost who left behind almost nothing except a torn scrap of paper with 2 words printed on it: Tamam Shud, Persian for finished, ended. By the time this story is over, you will understand why some mysteries refuse to die, no matter how much time, science, and effort is thrown at them. The beach at Somerton Park was a quiet, respectable stretch of sand just south of Adelaide, the kind of place where families picnicked and retirees took their evening walks. At around 6:30 in the morning, a jeweler named John Lyons was out for a swim when he noticed a man reclining against the seawall, legs stretched out, ankles crossed, a half-smoked cigarette resting on his collar, as though it had simply fallen from his lips. Lyons assumed the man was drunk or asleep. He mentioned it to another beachgoer who agreed the man hadn't moved in the time they'd been watching. It wasn't until later that morning, when the body was still in exactly the same position, that anyone thought to call the police. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, well-built, with strong muscular calves that suggested an active life. A dancer, perhaps, or an athlete. He was immaculately dressed: a European-cut suit jacket, a fashionable tie, a white shirt, polished shoes. Everything about his appearance suggested a man of some means, someone who took care of himself. And yet nothing in his pockets told anyone who he was. There was a used bus ticket, a pack of chewing gum, 2 combs, a half-empty pack of cigarettes, oddly containing a different, more expensive brand than the packet itself, a box of matches. And that was all. No wallet, no cash, no keys, no identification of any kind. Stranger still, when detectives examined his clothing more closely, they discovered that every single maker's label had been meticulously removed, cut out, not torn, with what must have been careful, deliberate scissor work. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure this man could not be traced through his clothes. The initial assumption was natural causes, perhaps a heart attack, perhaps suicide. But the post-mortem examination would soon make it clear that nothing about this case was going to be simple. Constable John Moss, one of the first officers on the scene, later described an unsettling stillness about the whole tableau. There was no vomit, no sign of a struggle, no disturbance in the sand around the body. The man looked more than anything like someone who had simply decided to stop. His posture, legs extended, arms at his sides, head tilted gently against the seawall, suggested neither pain nor panic. It was the posture of a man at rest, not a man in his final, desperate moments. That calm would haunt investigators for years, because whatever had killed him had apparently done so without a fight.
Word spread quickly through Adelaide, a city that in 1948 still thought of itself as orderly, provincial, and safely removed from the turmoil convulsing post-war Europe. A well-dressed stranger, dead on a suburban beach with no name and no history, did not fit the city's self-image. Reporters descended within hours. By the following morning, photographs of the unidentified man's face, eyes closed, expression eerily peaceful, were splashed across newspapers from Adelaide to Sydney to Melbourne, accompanied by a simple, unanswerable question. Does anyone know this man? No one did. Or if someone did, they said nothing. The autopsy, conducted by pathologist John Dwyer, only deepened the mystery. The man's spleen was found to be enormously enlarged, roughly 3 times its normal size. His liver was congested with blood. There was evidence of internal bleeding in the stomach lining, and yet, remarkably, there was no obvious poison detected in his system, despite extensive and repeated toxicology testing. Dwyer noted that the pattern of internal damage strongly suggested poisoning, and he privately believed a rare, fast-acting toxin was responsible. But standard tests of the era found nothing conclusive. Digitalis was considered, strychnine was considered, barbiturates were considered. Each was ruled in, then ruled out, then reconsidered again over the following weeks as investigators grew increasingly frustrated. There were no needle marks apart from what appeared to be an old vaccination scar. There was no obvious cause of death that fit neatly into the coroner's usual categories. The dead man's heart, lungs, and other organs showed no disease that would explain sudden collapse. Whatever had killed him had done so from the inside, leaving almost no external trace. The signature, some believed, of a poison so exotic that Australian toxicologists in 1948 simply did not have the tools to detect it. The body was fingerprinted and photographed. Copies were circulated to every police force in Australia, and eventually to international agencies including Scotland Yard and the FBI. Nothing came back. No missing persons report matched him. No criminal record matched his prints. It was as though the man had never officially existed at all. Meanwhile, the coroner's staff prepared the body for burial, uncertain whether anyone would ever come to claim it. A plaster cast was made of his head and torso, a grim insurance policy in case identification ever became possible. Then he was embalmed, an unusual and expensive step for an unidentified body. Specifically so that if someone did eventually come forward, they could still view his face. No one came forward. Not that week. Not that year. Not for the rest of the 20th century. Detectives combed through missing persons files from across the country, checked hotel registries, questioned taxi drivers, and appealed to the public through radio broadcasts. They tracked down every tailor in Adelaide capable of that kind of precise, deliberate label removal, hoping someone might recognize their own work. None did. They circulated the man's photograph to merchant navy unions, to immigration authorities, to every police department in the British Commonwealth. The silence that came back was total, and it was that silence, more than any single piece of evidence, that convinced investigators they were dealing with someone who had gone to extraordinary lengths to vanish or to be erased. Some detectives began to wonder, quietly at first, whether the case might reach beyond the ordinary machinery of local policing altogether. Nearly 2 months after the discovery, in January 1949, a break appeared to come from an unlikely place: the Adelaide railway station's left luggage office. A brown suitcase had been checked in on November 30th, 1948, the day before the body was found, and never collected. Inside were more clues, and more dead ends. A stenciled name, T. Keene, had been sewn into some of the clothing. But when investigators traced the name, no missing man named T. Keene matched the description. The tags of nearly every item, again, had been carefully removed, exactly as with the clothes on the body. It was the same deliberate erasure, repeated. There was a coat with a distinctive, unusual stitching pattern, later identified as a style used exclusively in the United States, not sold in Australia at the time. There was a table knife with its handle cut down and sharpened, a pair of pliers, a screwdriver, and a small brush of the type used by tailors to remove lint. Whoever this man was, he seemed to have some connection either to tailoring or textiles, or he wanted investigators to think he did. Investigators examined the suitcase's contents under strong light, searching for laundry marks, dry cleaning stamps, anything that might have survived the deliberate scrubbing of identity. They found faint traces of a laundry code on a few items, but when cross-referenced against Adelaide's cleaning services, none matched. The coat's American-style stitching raised its own uncomfortable question. Had this man traveled from overseas, perhaps recently, perhaps under circumstances he wanted no one to trace? Immigration records of the period were incomplete and inconsistently kept, and no arrival matching his likely profile could ever be confirmed. By now, Adelaide newspapers had given the case a name that would stick for the rest of the century: the Somerton Man. And the police, despite their best efforts, were no closer to knowing who he was than they had been on the morning his body was found. Months after the initial autopsy, a pathologist re-examining the dead man's clothing discovered something that had been missed the first time: a small pocket, sewn into the waistband of his trousers, so tightly concealed it functioned almost like a secret compartment. Inside was a tightly rolled scrap of paper. On it, in a printed, elegant typeface, were two words: Tamam Shud. The phrase came from the final page of a Persian collection of poetry called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book of philosophical verses about fate, mortality, and the fleeting nature of life. Tamam Shud appeared at the very end of the text, meaning roughly, "It is ended," or "finished." It was, in effect, the last line of the book, the words an author might use to close a story forever. The discovery ignited a nationwide search. Police issued a public appeal asking anyone who owned a rare first-edition copy of the Rubaiyat, missing its final page, to come forward. Weeks later, a man walked into a police station with exactly that: a copy of the book with its final page torn out, found in the back seat of his unlocked car, parked near Somerton Beach around the time of the man's death. When investigators matched the torn edge of the scrap of paper to the missing page of the book, it fit perfectly. The connection was undeniable. Somehow, this specific book, in this specific car, was tied to the man on the beach. But instead of answering the case's biggest question, the book asked several new ones. Because on the book's back cover, faintly visible under ultraviolet light, was a cluster of handwritten capital letters, arranged in 5 short lines, along with a phone number. The phone number led police to a young woman living in the nearby suburb of Glenelg. A nurse the media would later refer to only as Jestyn, an alias she herself had once used. When shown the plaster cast of the dead man's face, witnesses reported that she appeared visibly shaken, though she denied recognizing him. Investigators soon learned that Jestyn had once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which she had given, some years earlier, to a man she had known during the war, a lieutenant she'd had a relationship with before her marriage. Whether that man was the man on the beach was never definitively established, but the coincidence was, to say the least, extraordinary. Then there was the code itself. 5 lines of capital letters, some struck through, arranged in a pattern that resembled no cipher Australian code breakers, nor later British and American military cryptographers had ever seen. Decades of attempts by professional and amateur codebreakers alike failed to crack it. Some concluded it was a genuine cipher, possibly related to espionage. Others believed it might simply be the first letters of a poem or set of phrases, an aid memoir rather than a true code. To this day, no one has produced a solution that the wider community of cryptographers accepts as definitive. The Cold War was just beginning to freeze into place in 1948, and Adelaide, quietly, was becoming home to a highly sensitive weapons testing facility at nearby Woomera. Speculation exploded. Was the Somerton Man a spy, a courier, a defector killed to keep secrets from crossing borders? Investigators found no hard evidence to confirm it, but they never fully ruled it out, either. And the presence of Jestyn, evasive and unwilling to explain her connection, only deepened suspicion that something was being hidden. Military cryptographers from both Australian and, reportedly, American intelligence circles examined the code in the years that followed, and each, in turn, walked away without a confirmed solution. Some analysts noted the letters bore a statistical resemblance to the initial letters of English words, suggesting a message rather than a mathematically structured cipher. Others pointed out that the second and fourth lines appeared strikingly similar, as though the author had made an error and begun again. The kind of mistake a person under pressure, working quickly, might make. Whether that person was encoding a message of love, of guilt, or of national secrets has never been settled, and probably never will be.
Jestyn died decades later, without ever offering a full explanation. Her family, when later approached by researchers and journalists, expressed anger at the intrusion into her past. Whatever she knew, she carried most of it to her grave. For over 60 years, the Somerton Man lay in an Adelaide cemetery under a headstone that read simply, "Here lies the unknown man." Theories about his identity multiplied with each passing decade. Some believed he was a Soviet spy, silenced before he could be exposed. Others thought he might have been an American agent operating undercover in Australia. Still, others suspected a far more mundane explanation. A heartbroken man, abandoned by a lover, who took his own life in a deliberately theatrical, anonymous way, erasing every trace of his identity so that no one would ever know how he had failed. Amateur investigators pored over the case for decades, publishing books, building websites, and traveling to Adelaide to examine what evidence remained. One of the most persistent was Professor Derek Abbott, a University of Adelaide engineering researcher whose obsession with the case eventually led him somewhere no one expected, into a personal connection with Jestyn's family. Abbott would go on to marry Jestyn's granddaughter, a development so strange that even seasoned investigators of the case struggled to process it. Some called it fate, others called it deeply uncomfortable. Either way, it placed Abbott in a unique position to push for something previous generations of investigators had never had the technology to attempt: DNA analysis. For years, Abbott campaigned for permission to exhume the Somerton Man's remains, arguing that modern genetic testing could finally answer the question that had haunted Adelaide for 2 generations. Authorities resisted for a long time, citing legal and ethical concerns about disturbing a grave more than 70 years old. But public interest in the case had never faded, and in 2021 the South Australian government finally granted permission. Throughout those decades of waiting, the Somerton Man's grave became something of a pilgrimage site for the case's devoted followers: retired detectives, cryptography enthusiasts, university researchers, and true crime writers from around the world. Some left flowers. Others left copies of the Rubaiyat, folded open to its final page. Documentary crews from Britain, the United States, and Japan traveled to Adelaide to film the headstone, the beach, the seawall where the body had been found, all in pursuit of an answer that had eluded professional investigators for 2 generations. Every few years, a new theory would surface: a Latvian merchant sailor, a Swedish diplomat's courier, a jilted lover who staged his own erasure. And each theory would generate fresh headlines, fresh excitement, and, ultimately, fresh disappointment when it failed to hold up against the available evidence. In May 2021, the Somerton Man's grave was opened for the first time since his burial in June 1949. Forensic teams carefully extracted skeletal remains and hair samples, hoping that enough genetic material had survived 7 decades underground to produce a usable DNA profile. The process took months. Researchers extracted DNA from hair follicles still attached to the man's scalp, comparing genetic markers against enormous public genealogy databases, the same tool that had, in previous years, helped identify long-cold serial killers and unidentified victims elsewhere in the world. In July 2022, Abbott and genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick announced a breakthrough. Using genetic matches to distant relatives, they traced a family tree that pointed toward a man named Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer born in Melbourne in 1905. Webb, they believed, had a documented estranged wife, no clear employment history around the time of his death, and, significantly, no confirmed sightings or records after the mid-1940s. For the first time in 73 years, there was a name. But even this apparent resolution did not fully satisfy the case's obsessive following. Webb's own family expressed surprise. Some genealogists and researchers pointed to lingering uncertainties in the DNA methodology, noting that the identification, while compelling, had not been formally confirmed through the same rigorous chain of custody that a court of law might demand. The South Australian Coroner's Office indicated it would need to conduct its own formal review before officially closing the case. As of the most recent public updates, the identification of Charles Webb remains the leading theory, widely reported, broadly accepted by many researchers, but still not universally regarded as the final, unimpeachable word. And even if the name is settled, the deepest questions remain wide open. Why were all his labels removed? Why did he carry a page torn from a rare volume of Persian poetry, hidden in a secret pocket? What did the code on the back cover mean, if anything? Who was Jestyn to him, and why did she never explain her connection? What actually killed him, and why did it leave no trace that 1948 science or even much later toxicology could identify? The Somerton Man story has become one of the most enduring, unsolved mysteries in the English-speaking world. Not because nothing was ever discovered, but because every discovery seemed to generate more questions than it resolved. A name emerged after 7 decades. Yet the manner of his death, the meaning of the code, and the true nature of his connection to a nurse in Glenelg remain unresolved even now. Perhaps that persistence is the real reason the case has fascinated so many for so long. It offers something rare, physical evidence, a body, a suitcase, a scrap of paper, a code, tangible enough to feel solvable, and yet resistant, decade after decade, to every tool thrown at it. Codebreakers failed, toxicologists failed, fingerprint databases failed. It took the entirely new science of consumer DNA genealogy, 73 years later, to even produce a name. And even that name arrived wrapped in caveats. Somewhere in that unmarked grave, now resealed, lies a man who once stood on a beach, dressed carefully, his labels cut away, a page of poetry folded into a hidden pocket, as though he had planned, with great precision, to disappear. Tamam Shud. It is ended. But is it? For those who have spent their careers, and in some cases their entire adult lives, chasing the truth of the Somerton Man, the ending has never quite felt finished at all.